This is so tall. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. Thanks for joining us for this event for Antoine Wilson's Mouth to Mouth. And we're also joined by Daniel Handler. You have that for Daniel? Yes, thank you. Thank you to everyone joining us online out there in TV land or on the internet, I suppose. We are still doing in-person events, so I'll say just at the top of the hour now while we're getting comfy, please do keep your masks on. I've checked everyone's ID and vax and everything, but it's a grace for our authors and ourselves and for keeping us as safe as possible and minimizing risk. So thanks for being cool about it. Before we get started, a couple of upcoming events I want to tell you folks about. On Tuesday, January 18th at 7 p.m., that's next Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, Dale Maharaj is going to be joining us to discuss his novel Burn Coast with Catherine Seligman. Maharaj is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and this is his debut novel. It's a rural noir set in Northern California about a cannabis grow operation full of intrigue. Very excited about it. That is this coming Tuesday, January 18th at 7 p.m. And then on Wednesday, February 2nd at 7 p.m. as well, we're excited to host John Darnielle for his latest novel. John Darnielle, Devil House. It's a satanic panic novel, so double intrigue, very fun. And he's going to be with Annalee Newitz. That is a ticketed event, so if you have any questions about that, you can just go to greenapplebooks.com, find more info there. It's going to be really cool. It's an offsite event, so it'll be a little bigger. We'll have some more space, and I'm excited. John Darnielle is great. So that's going to be Wednesday, February 2nd at 7 p.m. as well. We have a full list of our events on our website. You can find that at greenapplebooks.com. And all of our events, except for the one previously stated, are generally free of admission. So I'm not too shy of saying, please do buy books from us while you're here. You're in a bookstore, it's great. We live in San Francisco, support local arts, hello. And we appreciate it. I can think of at least 2 books that you can purchase this evening. So when you do that, it helps keep us here and helps us keep putting on events such as these. So thanks very much for doing that. Without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the authors joining us this evening. First, we have Daniel Handler, who is the author of 7 novels, including Why We Broke Up, We Are Pirates, All the Dirty Parts, and most recently, Bottle Grove. As Lemony Snicket, he's responsible for numerous books for children, including a series of unfortunate events, All the Wrong Questions, and most recently, Poison for Breakfast. He's one of our favorites and yours. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Handler. And joining us tonight, Antoine Wilson is an award-winning writer and author of the novels The Interloper and Panorama City. His writing has appeared in the Paris Review, Quarterly West, and Best New American Voices, among other publications. He's a contributing editor at A Public Space. He's taught at the University of Iowa, UC San Diego, and Otis School of Art and Design, and elsewhere. His latest novel, Mouth to Mouth, is the reason we are here this evening. So please join me in welcoming Antoine Wilson.
Hello. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
You already took your mask off.
I was passive aggressively sipping water.
Oh, unmasked.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's nice to see people in a real bookstore. And for those of you who are watching virtually, it's nice that you're here. Thank you for coming. I'm very excited about this book. I've been an Antoine Wilson fan since way back, since The Interlopers, his first novel. And there was a novel in between, Panorama City, which is very groovy. And all of his books are individual marvels. That's one of the things I want to talk about. But just by way of introduction, I would say that the first one has I would say a groovy Kafka aura of dread, which is one of my favorite things in the world about anything. And then Panorama City is like a defiantly happy book, which takes guts, and no one gives you any guts because they like to be snooty about a happy book. It's a really beautiful book. And then this, I will say, I was nervous, not because I didn't trust that the book would be good, but logistically, I was out of the city and this book was being sent to me in order to do this event here in the city. And so I knew that I wouldn't have the kind of time that I normally like to have for the book before an event. And so I had this kind of panic about it. And because it had been a couple of years in my head, it was going to be like a 700-page book. I could have easily looked that up.
It was 700 pages and we cut it down for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Just in time.
Yeah, hardly any book was too short, is what I tell students.
Yeah.
And I got it and I held it in my hands, and it's like I can scarcely remember the actual act of reading it because I gobbled it up so quickly. And I don't, that sounds like a loaded compliment for some reason in some way, but it is like an elegant, quick, thrilling read. So for people who are watching at home and who are here in the store and who are like, I want a book, but I don't want one of those books where like 5 weeks later, I'm like, I really should read more. This is not one of those books. This is one of those books where like your coffee is cold and then you're all done with the book and you're so thrilled to be in its gripping grip. So welcome, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you.
Congratulations on this very good book.
Woo, thank you.
Yeah. So with all of your books, I always have this thing about like, what is this book? I remember when you sent me the Interlopers and I started it, I had in my mind, my theory of the book kept changing.
I think you say who is something like you blurbed it.
I did.
I think you said something like, who is this guy?
That sounds about right.
Right.
That sounds
Right.
like something I would say. And with this book, I've now seen it described. When I finished it last night, I then looked up what other people were saying about this book, as I do, because I don't want to express an opinion that's contrary to anyone else's opinion on the internet. And
That's a good policy.
yeah, how can that go wrong? And many people are saying it's a thriller.
I know, isn't that weird?
Yeah, and I like it because I feel like a publisher would love to call any book a thriller,
Mhm.
because if they can't call it a thriller, then they have to call it like an exploration,
Right.
and then they're nervous, and then if they can't call it an exploration, they have to call it a meditation, and then they might as well burn money in the backyard as far as they're concerned.
Yeah, and in fact, it was sort of reviewed before it came out in a roundup by Sarah Lyle in the New York Times gift guide, among other thrillers. And so in a sense, I'm very grateful for that, because that means people might actually, buy it and want to read it.
Is it a thriller in your head?
So my deal is just that I want, every next page to be at least as interesting and compelling as the page before it.
That's a brave stance.
Right. So
Most
I mean,
writers
at
don't
least-
want that.
Yeah, no, I know. They usually want to go the other way, backward into just dullness. So I don't know. I found it interesting that people described it as a thriller. I think it has some aspects of it that maybe are thriller-like. But I'm not well versed in the genre of thrillers. So people who come to it thinking they're getting something that's sort of going to follow the genre rules of a thriller might be like, well, what is this? Whereas people who read a lot of literary fiction or maybe just non-genre-y stuff might say this is a thriller because I'm gripped and I'm moving forward and there's tension.
It feels to me like a thriller in the way that real life has its moments of being a thriller. Because the premise of I'm kind of nervous about certain things to say about this book, including there's like some big twists towards the end, which obviously I will not give away. But the premise of the book is that a man runs into another man who he hasn't seen since his school days in the airport, and they sit in the first class lounge, and our hero, who I think of as the hero of the book, oddly, because all he does is hear the story.
Right. The narrator, we'll call it.
Yeah, that's a good
Narrator hero.
Yeah, let me write that down.
Yeah.
Narrator. For those of you who are taking notes on the
Yeah.
internet, write that down too. That's a literary term that we writers use. Narrator. Yeah. But it feels a little bit like The Wizard of Oz is about a girl who falls and hits her head in Kansas, right? Like that's not what it's about. Obviously, it's the story that he's hearing.
Right.
But the story, while it contains vaguely some elements of thrillerdom, you have a nervous feeling the whole time that you're hearing the story. You don't know if the story is entirely true. You don't know what you're supposed to think about it. And it has the unnervingness of someone telling you a really long story.
But to some extent, you described that, and my first impulse is, dude, I didn't mean to stress you out.
Yeah.
But I guess, there's a pleasure in that, maybe. And
yeah. Well, I mean, it reminds me of that you spend a lot of life, like we're in a situation now, the reason why we're all masked and had to be vaccinated if we're here in this room is because of a suspense story that's going on in our own lives all the time.
Right.
But even before this hit, we know what it is to be in suspense, even when we're not doing something like blackmailing someone or hoping that we won't be caught as a murderer or other things that happen in thrillers. And this book achieves that energy. And I was curious how much of that was conscious and how much of it is just because you're good.
It's all just because I'm good.
Well,
I was just saying that to see what it sounded like. I don't like it. No, well, I mean, I was conscious that the guy who's telling the story, his name is Jeff Cook, and he's an art dealer. And the man that he rescues, Jeff Cook, the beginning of his story starts with him pulling somebody out of the ocean in Santa Monica. And he's just out of college. He's just gone through this bad breakup, and he's kind of got nothing going on. And he rescues this guy from the ocean who is an art dealer. And the sort of rescue apparatus picks the guy up and takes him away. And Jeff is left on the beach with just the wool blanket and kind of, what the hell just happened, And he essentially decides that he needs to figure out who he rescued, I guess is what happens. And he ends up sort of worming his way into Francis Arsenault's life, who is the guy he rescued. And that's how eventually Jeff becomes an art dealer. But there's a fair amount of deception built into that plot, just that story. And then the fact that Jeff is telling the narrator and the story, and also mentioning that he's never told the story to anyone before. So it's sort of odd that he would be telling somebody who hasn't seen in 2 decades and barely knows.
Yeah, always
so there's
an unnerving introduction, I would say. When someone says to me, do you want to hear something that I've never told a living soul? My instinct is, no, I don't.
Right.
I don't want to hear that.
No. So there's that, there's a second layer of, I guess, of tension between, in the airport lounge between Jeff and the narrator.
And are those layers of is that one of the things that you were primarily interested in, or were you interested in the kind of story within the story?
I would say first I was interested in the story within the story. This book took many years to develop. In fact, there are 2 novels. One, I kept sort of serially abandoning one book and then coming back to the other, and this was one of the 2. The other one, I think, maybe just a sacrificial twin. Unfortunately, it's finished, but it doesn't work. But this one, I just kept basically, I was working on the sort of relationship between a rescuer and someone he's rescued, and it took me a little while to settle on him rescuing somebody who you might call toxic in some way, and a while to settle on that guy being an art dealer.
Right.
And so those pieces fell into place. But at a certain point, I had that story, and I was interested in that sort of, that sort of his insinuating himself into Francis Arsenault's life, and it just didn't quite work for me. While working on the other book, I reread Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. And this book has nothing to do with Austerlitz and is not like Austerlitz in any way other than the sort of narrative strategy of having a narrator between the story, between the reader and the sort of central story. And it was while reading that I thought, this approach might work for me. And it just clicked after that. I finished work on the other novel, then I went back to this with that in mind. And so I would say it was very intuitive in terms of how that came to be.
And one of the things that this brings up to me is this balance there, where there's part of this book that feels intensely realistic, in a like purposefully banal way. And it is the way that he's in the airport and he hears this story, and you draw very much the first class lounge and the experience of hearing a long story in pieces and, oh, who wants another beer? And now I have to go to the bathroom, and these things that feel extremely realistic, and it somehow makes the rest of the story seem fantastic, which it really isn't in a way. I mean, it is more eventful than sitting in an airport,
Right.
It solves almost everything. And
Maybe,
through the prism of it being super realistic, the story that he's telling becomes this kind of mythological, almost allegorical story.
Yeah,
And is that important to you?
maybe. I mean, maybe that's what, there was a need for an extra layer of distance between that story and the reader for whatever reason. And yeah, I'm not sure why. Maybe that's because just on some level I had to do that to believe it. But I also was really excited. Like the first line of the book, the first words of the book are, I sat. It's totally static. And I love that it's totally static and it's kind of real time what's happening in the lounge. And but I didn't want to write a book of just direct and indirect dialogue of this guy telling the story in real time. So the book cuts away to these, it's almost like a film, right? Like cutting away to the to the reenactment. So the reenactment is in a close third person, which I just found was very natural for telling that story, much more so than earlier drafts where Jeff was blah blah blahing the whole story.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's something about the curiosity that is in this book that I found really interesting. So as you say, Jeff Cook rescues someone and then wants to find out more about who he's rescued.
Yeah.
And he ends up following him in this way that I think is eerily familiar. I think particularly in the world of the internet, and the way that you can look someone up and really kind of learn a bunch of stuff about them for no good reason often than your own curiosity. And that it's unnerving to do that. It's unnerving, you're behaving creepily, but everybody does it. There's not a single person who doesn't say, oh, I'm gonna go look this up. Like, I haven't thought of this person in years, or I just met them, or look, their spouse, I'm gonna look up that. And there's something about that surveillance and that growing closer that draws this real aura of menace, even though it's a super banal thing and everyday thing to do. Well, and in his case, you kind of don't blame him.
He also has to put in a lot more effort than we do, right? Because this is happening in the 90s. He discovers the art gallery exists from an online search, but this is back when search engines had editors, actual people who would choose what would come up on top. And then he has to go, he hoofs it over to the University Research Library at UCLA. So he's got to print things out and Xerox them and then take them home to investigate.
That felt noir-y to me. Reminded me of like Philip Marlowe keeps doing that in LA. It's like, so then I went to the library and then I found out the blackmail ring started in the back of the bookstore. I remember even when I was young and I started to read Raymond Chandler for the first time, I was like, that never happens when I go to the library. Like, I never find anything cool.
Yeah. I mean, I just also love the idea of trying to piece together someone's life, through whatever documents they leave behind and where they work and what they do in their family. It's a portrait of Francis Arsenault that's in the, that's one more layer back in the novel.
Yeah. And I think there's something because, again, the narrator, the term I learned today, is we don't hear what he thinks about the story, really, that much.
A little bit, but not much.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we get all this information, and part of the information is that so many people weigh in on what kind of person Francis is.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we follow him, we hear these people say how cool he is and how successful he is, and then what a monster he is. And we see his own behavior that we're weighing against what people think. And that I think has just a great claustrophobia to it. There's something kind of magical about, you hear someone is an asshole and then you see them and then through the prism of knowing that someone else thinks they're an asshole, you reach your own conclusion, even though everybody thinks someone's an asshole.
Right. Well, in terms of reaching your own conclusion, in this book, more so than my previous books, and I don't know, feel like I'm heading in this direction. I've been trying to leave more, I mean, this book kind of just grabs you by the lapels, but in another way, I've been trying to leave more room for the reader to come to certain conclusions. And people, you know, have asked me like, what, because of other things that happen in the book, do you think Jeff Cook is a sociopath or a psychopath? This guy who's telling the story. And you know, I'm like, well, you know, actually, I don't think so, but I think that a reader who thinks that's the case would be completely justified in reading the book that way.
I mean, the way Jeff Cook talks about himself, I feel like there's so much philosophizing in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered, like, is this a novel of ideas to you? I mean, every novel is a novel of ideas, I guess. But in some cases, there's some conversations that are actually about ambition and vengeance and art and the market and things like this that feel like big heady ideas that someone else might write a bunch of essays on, and many people have. Is this something, is that what you feel like you're doing, is tossing big ideas around?
Not in so many words, but I do have ideas about these things, right? So they seep into the fiction. And I think I mean, the other thing is I have this weird thing, like I have this awareness of all the drafts and things that came before. And so some of these things that you mentioned as ideas are, you know, they were a whole, you know, paragraphs or digressions. I'm not much of an essayist, so I don't think I would develop those ideas in that way, but I did in the late 90s and early 2000s, I did work in the art world in Beverly Hills, and I had ideas. I mean, I had really experiences that sort of resulted in ideas, some of which are very similar to what Jeff goes through in terms of just confronting the value, these paintings. You show up and you look, you know, this painting is $750,000 or 1.2 million, and this is what a house costs. And you're just shocked, like, who's buying and selling these paintings? And then you're in the world for a while. I was working for an appraiser. So I didn't have any art history education. So I came in and I learned about contemporary and post-war art from auction catalogs. Everything had a price tag on it.
Right.
But I also gained a genuine appreciation for the work, which Jeff does to some degree. But then at a certain point, I you know, because I'm helping putting values on these things or figuring out what a fair market value is for these works, you know, I'm like, no, this is not a, you know, this is a $2.5 million painting. Come on, of course it is. Right. You know, and but I don't have $2.5 million. I went to the Frieze art fair when it came to LA pre-pandemic, and I saw some work by an artist whose work had blown me away when I saw it installed at the Whitney or something. And I was like, oh wow, there's his work. I could buy some. I could have some of that for my house.
Right.
And I was looking at it, and it was this beautiful piece. It was $55,000, and my first thought was, that is a freaking bargain.
Right.
Right. $55,000.
Yeah.
And because it's amazing work. It's profound. I had this experience, and if I were a fancy art collector, yeah, 55,000. You know, sure. Nothing.
Right.
But
so
that's
not
like,
unheard of sum for a painting, for sure.
No, not even close to unheard of. But that's like, you know, like a really nice car, you know, or you know, more than a year of
many
tuition.
hardcover books.
Many hardcover books. Yeah, I could buy a lot of books.
10 or 12, I think.
Right. So you know, maybe so I have to just buy the monograph and put it on my shelf. But you get this weird sense of what the values are, and it's like, yes, that is the value. I agree with that, but it doesn't really connect to my actual life.
Yeah,
I think the art is worth that, but
sure.
Yeah, I just can't afford it.
Right. Or yeah, I want it to be cheaper for me always.
Well,
but I thought that with real estate too.
Yeah.
You're like, but I love this house. You don't get it.
Yeah. But
I shouldn't have to pay like a lot of money.
You can write a letter.
I love it.
You can write a letter.
Yeah.
Yeah. They well, real estate though has so much more inherent value.
Yeah, well, it's maybe easier to make the case.
Yeah.
I was trying to think about why there are so many novels about visual art, more than there are. I mean, there's plenty of novels about all art forms, but visual art way more, I think.
More than music.
Way more than music, way more than theater, more than,
Well, theater, there are a bunch.
yeah. I
But
mean, there's-
music, I feel like you have to have special knowledge. Whereas with
Right.
visual art, you can wing it.
I was actually wondering if part of it is that novelists make a thing that's reproduced, right? So there's no $22 million, there's no $2 million book.
There's one, the NFT version of Mouth to Mouth.
Right. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
2 million.
Yeah, and it comes with Melania's eyelashes. I think.
That's right. That's right.
Super cool.
Yeah.
But you know that we're in the
NFT stands for not freaking true.
But anyway, I just
Yeah.
wondered if that was the case, because there's something, right? There's like a unique painting. The reason why that's $55,000 is because there isn't another one.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like if somehow they
But you can-
made a gazillion of them.
Yeah, but you can there's also prints that are 55,000,
Right.
limited edition, but it's still a limited. Yes, there's scarcity, I guess, involved. There's the hand of the artist,
Yeah.
all kinds of different components that factor into that kind of value.
Do you think when you worked in art, it taught you a lot about writing?
No, not specifically. I mean, I wrote a lot of sort of capsule, biographies and why this piece is significant,
Right.
and edited things that my boss was writing quite a lot. But I don't know. It taught me about the specialized jargon that you use to describe artwork,
Right.
but I'm not sure that it affected my view of writing in any way. Specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why?
I'm just curious. I mean, there's a really powerful scene in the book. Well, I want you to read soon, but there's a really powerful scene in the book that happens at an art opening where you see a showdown between this art dealer that you're trying to get a grip on, Francis, and between an artist, and it's just
Yeah.
about the hanging of the painting.
Oh, yeah. The artist's intentions.
Right, and,
Yeah.
and so the artist says, "I want them hung this way," and the gallery dealer is like, "Screw you, I'm doing it this way." And as the party continues, you get to the bottom of the kind of game that the art dealer is playing and why that painting is in a particular place.
Right.
And I couldn't decide at the end of it whether that had changed my mind or not about.
You mean whether he was right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because his job is to sell the art.
Right.
And so but he has a plan all along, and it's a smart plan. It's not a shallow, nasty plan.
Right.
It's something he's thought about it, and he's doing.
And the artist
This thing.
also has a reason.
Yeah.
But when the bullet hits the bone, it's the dealer's reason that triumphs.
Yeah.
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 And the artist's reason is blown off as sort of a notion.
When I mean, if you're an artist in this world, you're arguing with capitalism all the time.
Right.
And I always think there's this horrible feeling when you're arguing with capitalism, sometimes that capitalism is right. And that's why it's so infuriating.
Yes.
Like that you're actually wrong in your argument. You want something some way, but it's not the way it should be.
Right. It's because, right. I want it this way because that's the way I want it.
Yeah.
That's the way I feel it should be. And then somebody else will say, well, actually, the bottom dollar dictates that it can't be that way.
Yeah.
And so capitalism has the last word.
Right.
Out of necessity.
Yeah. It's powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But not great.
No. All right. Read a little bit. You're going
I'll
to read
read.
from the beginning.
I'm reading from
This is a good part.
sort of in the beginning. Jeff, part of Jeff's story here. So Jeff is
I'm going to walk off stage or off camera.
okay. So Jeff, he's been broken up with. This is post-college. He's kind of adrift. And he wakes up one morning to the sound of air whistling through his beloved's nose, but it's actually his own nose and she's not there. And so he wakes up yet again. She's not there. And he's sad and it's still dark out, but he decides to just go to the ocean, go sit on the beach and watch the sun come up. So sad Jeff. The sun was not yet up. This will be, by the way, about 4 minutes of reading. I don't want to go too long. The sun was not yet up. From atop the bluffs, the beach was a dark gray strip, the ocean black. In the dark, he walked across the pedestrian bridge over PCH from one pool of light to the next. The beach lot was empty, nobody around other than a cyclist whizzing past, chasing an amber beam emanating from a box on his handlebars. The sky was a deep brown black, low clouds reflecting the city's light back onto itself. A distant lump in the sand was either a nuzzling couple or a sleeping homeless person. The immensity of the ocean was already having an effect on him, diminishing the size of his problems, connecting him to everything elemental and all but eternal. He took off his shoes and socks, then stepped barefoot onto the cold sand, feeling a sense of liberation at his own insignificance, while also feeling, because he was alone, because it was dark, because the entire city lay behind him asleep, a sense of himself as a sort of local god, surveying his domain under a cloak of invisibility and omnipotence, two sides of the same coin. He sat at the water's edge, the dry sand just above the high tide line, and the cold seeped through the seat of his pants. He could make out the horizon, splitting the view, the most distant visible thing on earth. He fantasized about being dropped off out there, halfway to Japan, treading water, succumbing to exhaustion. He didn't know then that from his vantage, the seemingly infinitely distant line was less than 2 nautical miles away. He was no better at estimating the dimensions of his heartbreak. With G, he felt like he was going somewhere, building a life. And now he felt like he'd been sent back to the starting line. As absurd as it would seem to him later and actually impossible to recreate in his memory, to recapture the intensity of it, G's absence from his life felt unrelenting and ever present. First thing he thought of upon waking and the last thing he thought of before sleep descended. A glow simmered behind him, fiat lux, a slow reveal, coaxing sea and sky from the void. Another day begun. Pelicans skimmed the slick water. The hazy outline of a ship appeared in the channel. Nearby seagulls squabbled over a piece of cellophane. High tide crests peaked but didn't break until they met the shore, ripples crossing the ocean from whatever storm had drummed them up, a rising of the waters. Energy passed from one molecule to another like a baton in a relay, transmitted all this way only to fizzle out on the sand. Just passing through, said a voice inside his head, source unknown, probably a bumper sticker. This happened sometimes. A voice or song appeared in his thoughts, unbidden but germane to whatever was going on at the moment, as if he didn't have one mind, but many, and his consciousness worked more like an orchestra conductor than a generator of its own ideas. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a dark form on the surface of the water. He was pretty sure it hadn't been there a moment before. A clump of kelp? No, a swimmer, making for the shore, an arm slapping the water, then drifting, as if scanning the bottom like a snorkeler without a snorkel, but then not. The swimmer undulated with the passing swell. The lack of muscle tension signaled to Jeff that something was wrong. He stood to watch, expecting the swimmer's arm to rise to slap the water again, or his head to turn for a breath, but nothing happened. He went to flag a lifeguard, but the towers were shuttered. Up and down the beach, there was only a single woman jogging, too distant to take notice. He hadn't yet faced a moment like this in his life, one in which he knew with certainty that the crisis at hand was his alone to deal with, one during which he wished for the intercession of the God he didn't believe in, or anyone who might know what to do, or even someone as clueless and panicked as himself who could by their presence share the burden. It was one of those crucial moments, one which, when reflected on, wouldn't be laughed off, but would send a chill up his spine, because even if he felt that he had no choice, that anyone would have done what he did in that situation, he would have to acknowledge that he was being tested. Because in truth, he could have given up, could have despaired, could have walked away, could have pretended he hadn't seen what he'd seen, could have subtracted himself from the scenario, told himself that he wasn't even there, that he'd left a moment too early or arrived a moment too late, that the predicament had not in fact fallen in his lap, but only grazed him as it passed undisturbed and unaddressed, left to unfold by itself, as nature might have intended. I pointed out that one's interceding or not could equally represent fate, that letting nature take its course could include any number of interventions, since we ourselves were inseparable from nature. He considered this for a moment, seemed about to reply, and sipped his beer instead.
I don't know if you know this about me, but I swim in open water most mornings. And so it's a nerve-wracking scene for me.
Yeah.
Because that's not how I plan on going.
Well, it's no. I actually am cool with being eaten by a shark. I surf a lot.
Really?
Yeah, I don't want it to happen, but
Right.
I just don't want to go out like on a treadmill or something. So I think I had this thing where I had a little syncopal episode on a treadmill, and it really freaked me out. I was like, I do not want to die in a gym.
Yeah,
I'd
that's
rather
fair.
be taken out by an apex predator.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem
That would be appended to your name forever.
in a good way. Maybe not.
I just
Maybe
think in a way.
it would overshadow things.
Yeah, I mean, like
They're more important.
people will be like, oh, my friend's grandfather
Right, he was just eaten
was
by
eaten
a
by a
shark.
shark.
Right,
You said that
Anything
years
else
ago. It
about
would be
him?
saved
No.
by people who never ever met.
right. Anything
Yeah.
else about it? No.
Nope, now that I know.
No,
Yeah,
just
that's all
shark,
I know.
Just eaten by a shark.
You mentioned once your grandfather was eaten by a shark.
Yeah, that's it.
It's the eaten too.
Huh?
It's eaten too. That's
Eaten.
the thing, not
Yeah.
just killed.
No.
Yeah, eaten.
Yeah, I guess killed because they don't. Once they take the first bite, they're done because they can taste that you're not a seal.
Yeah,
So they're like, oh, wrong buffet.
right.
And then you just bleed out.
Yeah, no,
For
I
no
think,
reason.
this is something I think about, and I think that it's like every time you've eaten something that you have one bite of,
Mhm.
and actually like a lounge in an airport is a perfect thing.
Like you
Like,
think
I'll
it's-
try this cheese. You're like, no, I won't.
right, or I'm gonna have this
That you might die. You're the cheese.
this
You're that
green
cheese.
tea mochi turns out to be a ball of wasabi.
Yeah,
You just
right. Or there's like a fixins bar, and you're like, I don't know what this is. I'll get a little thing of it. And
Yeah.
you dip it and munch it. I still don't know what it is.
This book has good fixings.
Takes like
There's
yeah.
a little row,
Yeah, that
and
does sound
it's
really
a really
good.
nice first class lineup.
Good one. Speaking of blood,
Yes.
yeah. So G, who's the Jeff Cook's girlfriend
College girl.
before the story begins,
Yeah.
really. She is an artist. She's a filmmaker,
Right.
And the only thing that we know about her work is that Jeff Cook says is that it's bloodless.
Well, actually, Jeff Cook says
That other people
she
said it
was
was
masterful, that it was masterful, but she thinks it's bloodless. You know,
Yeah.
because he thinks she's a great filmmaker, but then when the thesis prizes come out, some guy whose film is a total mess wins the award, and Jeff thinks this is unjust. And the professors have been encouraging her the whole time. And she says, no, they're right. You know, I have great craft or whatever, but my work is bloodless. And then she goes to work for the talent agencies.
Right.
Because she wants to be in the business.
Yeah. And then there's also an artist who I won't say more about in terms of the plot of the book, but whose name is Astrid, and her work is described in kind of a similar way. There's like nothing quite wrong with it, but it's not happening yet.
Yeah, her work is under the influence of another artist
Right.
still. And so it's student work. And she believes, because of the position that she's in, that her work is ready to be seen, which I don't know if you can identify with that, but that was me when I was starting out as a writer. I wrote terrible, you probably just were born and started writing perfectly, but I wrote these terrible stories and sent them directly to the New Yorker, you know?
Yeah.
And they just would come right back, like the same day.
I had some writers tell me like, oh, it's like, take your time. Like, I wish I hadn't published so early.
Mhm.
And I was always just like, well, so what? Like,
Right.
what? Like, yeah. And I used to think like, why don't you let me publish 8 books and then
And then we can
I'll get
talk
to be
about
like, oh, I wish I'd published later.
We'll talk about looking back.
Right. Yeah,
Well, there's a lot of looking back in this book.
there is. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that. Oh, I forgot who I was.
Yeah. I like those parts.
Yeah.
Well, what I wanted to say was that I was curious because of the both structurally and in the tone that you take, and I think we saw it just in that reading, where that is in some ways one of the most distant and calm descriptions of seeing someone who's struggling in the water and realizing that you have to save them,
Yeah,
that you can find in literature.
Yeah.
Many people would say, oh my God,
right, a lot of noise on the page.
yeah.
But it's retrospect, right? So
right. But I mean, some people tell a story to make you,
right, yeah.
Jeff
yeah.
Cook doesn't tell a story to make you feel like you're in the moment.
Right.
And a lot of people do. And I was curious if those descriptions, if there's a certain kind of purposeful bloodness that you're going for here, because there's something really chilly about this story. And when you hear that, when you see that scene here, I think we can all agree, you're in suspense and you're tense, but you're not, there's something unemotional also that is making it more dreadful rather than less.
Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah, I mean, I think probably part of it is that process of putting it in that close third person, like crunching it and compressing it and having it be retrospective, that I didn't necessarily want it to be just sort of loud.
Right.
It's just something he's been thinking about for a long time, and maybe even something he's thought about telling somebody for a long time. So it's settled in some ways into this idea of it being a crucial moment for him. In one of the seeds of this book happened to me in the 90s. This is all 90s stuff. But in 97, I was visiting Seattle.
You're listening to Beck.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to help you set the 90s
Beastie
scene.
Boys were just dropping something. They were playing their own instruments. It's a big deal.
Crazy.
So I was in Seattle, as one does in the 90s. And I was visiting with some friends, and this guy, we were down by the waterfront. This guy was just walking along air drumming, headphones on, whatever, and not paying attention to anything. And he was literally on a collision course with a full-size freaking freight train that was coming through. And I had this Jeff moment of my own, right?
Right.
Everything stops. And because it's like when you're in an intersection and you see somebody's crossing and the light has already changed, and you're like, please God, let that other car see that this is happening. So, but I was able to get his attention. And first he turned toward me and then kept walking toward the train because he was like, why is this guy yelling at me? But then he stopped, and then the train went right past him, and he just looked at me like, see, now I'm telling it like it's
you're not telling it.
No, I'm no Jeff. But he just looked at me and said, oh my God, you saved my life. I'm gonna buy you a big steak dinner. And then the train went by, and then he just kept walking and air drumming. And my friends just made fun of me for like the next 20 years about not getting a steak dinner out of it. And
this is crazy, but this man is here tonight.
I know, that's why. Why do you think I'm telling the story on the internet? I'm trying to track you down.
His name was
Where's
Chris.
That's right. Not just any steak dinner. I want that like 800 degrees or whatever they do there with butter. But so that concept of this sort of rescuer and rescued, or somebody who saves your life, was something that I've been playing with. About 10 years ago, I started playing with, trying to do it. And initially it was this absurd scenario where somebody saves somebody's life and he says, I'm going to buy you a steak dinner. It was a drowning though, but, and the rescuer is a sort of strange person. And then they go to the steak dinner, and then he's like, this was great, let's do it again, right? Because how many steak dinners add up to saved your life? Like, how do you repay somebody? Anyway, that didn't work out, but it led to this.
There is something I think really unsettling about the dodged emergency, right? I was thinking in a car.
Yeah.
It's like you narrowly miss someone.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, that was close. And you're like, anyway, as I was saying, this Tears for Fears song is terrible.
Right.
You like move on with your life.
Oh, I had one of those.
Yeah.
I was in Turkey. I was in a small town in Turkey in a tea house. I was playing Pishti, which is a Turkish card game.
How many more odd details are you going to? What were you wearing?
I was wearing corduroy pants and a sweater, and I was with these guys that were day laborers, working on what would become this big resort town, but at the time was nothing. And this kid walked in with a gun, and he was angry at this old man because this old man had said something about his mother or whatever. And this kid literally like popped off 2 shots in the tea house. And when you picture a tea house, right, in Turkey, you picture the rugs and the ornate everything. No, it looks like a cinder block classroom, right? This is just bare as heck. And shot, and pass to us. Like I'm sitting there and it's just bam, and it's this way, and he doesn't hit anybody. And then he marches out kind of teary-eyed, he's done his thing. And we kept playing.
Right.
Until we were done with the deck, then we all stopped and thought about what nearly happened. So there is a moment sometimes of where it doesn't yet sink in.
Yeah. This is funny. Now I feel the energy in the room. Everyone wants to tell their story. Everyone's like, oh, it happened to me. Call on me. But I'm not going to call on none of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's also, like, if I had gotten hit by a bullet, or if, Jeff had not seen this, I like to think of them as like fate's forks, right?
Right.
These moments where something could have gone a completely different way and it would have changed the entire course of your life. And this, for Jeff, is one of fate's forks. His saving Francis Arsenault puts his sort of somewhat directionless life right onto a very specific path that when you look back, you call it fate, but it's really just repackaged serendipity, right?
Yeah, well, also what I think is interesting is that he is at a time in one's life that I think many people in this room will find familiar with when you're directionless. It's like you're a couple years after college, you're like kind of smarter than everyone else in your head, but you still don't know what the hell you're doing. And you're interested in stuff, but you don't want to do any beginner work on anything.
Well,
And like you don't, yeah. I mean, you said the New Yorker. I remember thinking like,
yeah.
Well, if they asked me to be poetry editor of the New Yorker, of course I'd do that.
Wow.
But I'm not gonna like. I'm not gonna intern at the New Yorker.
I think we had different upbringings. I was pre-med in college, but I wanted to write also. And then at a certain point, I decided I was not going to go to medical school. I'd taken the MCAT, I did all of it, and I was like,
my parents always said that you can quit your successful medical practice when your novel sells.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So then I was like, based on nothing other than this knowledge that I carried within me that I wanted to be a novelist, I said that's what I'm going to do. So to a certain extent, that I think does not qualify as one of fate's forks, right? That's something that I had in me, and I'm like, oh, I'm a writer. Like that's just what I want to do. It's always kind of been there. However, my working for the fine art appraiser and being in that world in Beverly Hills and having that whole chapter of my life was, came down to a moment in the UCLA job board where this is you. So you would have gone you would have gone and become poetry editor, but short of that, you would have interned at the New Yorker. I was such a doofus, such a Jeff-like doofus that I thought, I want to be a writer. I'm going to go look at the job board, see what they have for books.
Right.
So it's a fine art and rare book.
Random House looking for novelists.
Yes, right, exactly. But no, this was a fine art and rare book appraiser. And I was like, well, books. Okay, that's where I should go.
Right.
This is not what I should have just gone to New York. But I didn't know.
Well, I guess
and then it turns out like 5% of her business was books. 95% was fine art. And I just ended up plunged into this whole other world. But it's all because I just was, picked that card.
Right, but that story in and of itself is kind of unsurprising.
Right.
Right, because you're a certain person in society. There's a certain there's one of many paths that are unsurprising for you. And one of the things that I think is interesting about
assassin.
This, right?
Yeah.
Or a day laborer in Turkey.
Right.
Right. And so I think there's something about the way that Jeff Cook is transformed by this, that he says that here's this important thing that happened, and where he ended up feels inevitable to us. And that's interesting to me.
Well, also Jeff is a very handsome, intelligent, white dude.
Right.
And Francis, his boss, is another white dude. So Jeff, skates along on quite a bit of privilege that he's not aware of. The book doesn't really make a meal out of it, but it's certainly present.
Well, I feel that's just so often, I don't know, so often someone says like, guess what? She married a guy and you'll never guess what he does for a living. And it's never that I can't guess.
Wow.
Right. It's never he dresses as a ladle and he's standing outside the restaurant all day long. It's never that.
Right. Right. You're talking about.
It's always like,
you're essentially talking about
like in this city, it's like, guess what? He works for like a company that does something with technology. You'll never believe it.
Right.
Yeah.
Startup guy. So yeah, part of that is class, right?
Yeah,
I mean, we don't have class here in America, but
thank God. But I think the notion of thinking about fate is in and of itself sometimes feels like a form of privilege, right? It's like because you've been taught that your
Oh,
life
yeah,
has like a very specific meaning,
right, like you're
and
right.
that every choice is like unbelievably surprising.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, if you take a broad view,
Yeah,
like not that many people are like, holy cow, that guy ended up publishing books. Like
Right.
that's crazy.
right. But then
It
there's
is crazy.
yeah, it's sort of what you're talking about reminds me of Steve Jobs talking about I took calligraphy. Who
Yeah.
knew that I would be designing fonts for Apple
Right.
later? He had like 3 different things that he did when he was just wandering around, and then he looks back and it's
Yeah.
like all of those things fed into.
Yeah, he was really good at computers too. That was the crazy thing.
Yeah. There is that.
Super good at that.
He also had a partner who was really good at computers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really good. Yeah, somebody should write that up. I'll take your questions in a minute, but I wanted to read this thing, see what you think about it.
Oh yeah,
I don't know why, because right before I read this book, I was reading an essay by D.H. Lawrence. You know that guy?
I've heard of him.
Yeah. This is about the novel, and it made me happy, and it felt specifically attuned to your novel. Are you ready?
Yes.
The novel is a great discovery, far greater than Galileo's telescope or somebody else's wireless, which cracked me up that D.H. Lawrence was like, it's somebody else, it's not Galileo. I'm not gonna go look it up. It's like someone made the wireless. Anyway.
He didn't have the internet.
Yeah. The novel is the highest form of human expression so far attained. Why? Because it is so incapable of the absolute.
Yes.
In a novel, everything is relative to everything else. If that novel is art at all, there may be didactic bits, but they aren't in the novel. And I think one of the things that is unfashionable about your book is that you take care as a severe understatement about how much you don't want us to know what anyone thinks of what anything is going on. And I think that is actually at its heart why it feels like a thriller. It's because you feel alone. Right. And a thriller is like where the guy loses his wallet and he's like in a foreign country and he has to do the thing and you feel alone. No one's telling you who the good guys are or what anyone should have done or how anything could be different. And I think that is a marvelous achievement.
That's fascinating. I think it must be in my temperament somewhere, because I had Michael Silverblatt interviewed me talking about Panorama City, my previous novel, which came out just a few years ago. And he said I had a kind of a poker face as a writer. And I made a Lady Gaga joke because I'm superficial. But for years, that statement has haunted me. And in essence,
well, what I would say is that your first novel makes this aura of dread, as I mentioned, you can't see the stitching and how that happens. I think your second novel is about happiness in such a way and makes people happy in a way that you don't know. And this novel really scares the hell out of you and it's hard to put a finger on.
Okay.
So my hat is off. And now I will call on questions, or I guess there's questions from the internet. Where do they come from? Oh, in the room.
The room.
We don't, if you have questions on the internet, look them up. We don't care. You're on the internet. Yeah, sure. Man in the black shirt, who I'm pretending I don't know right now.
So I can't wait to read this. I was thinking, have you read the book Amsterdam?
What happens in it?
Well, it has a scene in which this composer sees an assault happening and he could do something, but he chooses not to do something. It is that moment. He's called to it and he shrinks from it, and then his life is destroyed.
Oh.
I mean, horrible things happen everywhere because of this.
Is that the Suicide Pact book?
Sorry, I feel
I
obliged to summarize for people who are watching on the internet. The question is, have you read Amsterdam? Because it has a similar scene about deciding whether or not to save someone.
Yeah, and then but he doesn't.
But he doesn't.
That's a really interesting. I have read it. It was a long time ago, and like most books, that I've read and enjoyed, it just has become a feeling, So I didn't remember that particular scene.
That's just the way you set up the moment's set up there in a similar way, and you think that he's like, because he's got momentum, he's doing this Millennium composition, and then it turns out that it's completely plagiarized, like everything goes wrong. Anyway, but it's interesting. I was thinking another question was, or thing I wanted to ask about is, you talked, or Daniel talked about how, and you said this thing, you just want the next page to be more thrilling with the previous one. And I think it is possibly the fact that if the story being told to someone and you want to retain that person's interest, did that change the writing? That to imagine someone sitting in a lounge and whether they're going to continue to, or whether they're going to not be bored by it, and to want to let you actually open up the story creates that imperative to make it.
Right.
Sorry, and again, I'll try to sum
Yeah.
up, which is the question is, you said you wanted always the next page to be more interesting, and the fact that this is a told book, that someone is telling a story, was that part of the construction.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, because when something is told, it can take on the air of a tale, right? I mean, is it the turn of the screw that has that? It's got multi-nested narrators as well.
Yeah, it was one of the books that this recalled for me, with Turn of the Screw.
Oh.
And one of the things that Turn of the Screw does, which your book kind of does as well, is that it doesn't close all of those parentheses.
Right.
Turn of the Screw, they say, now I'm going to read you the manuscript, and then they read you the manuscript, and the manuscript is over, and we never get back to all
Right.
the people who were sitting around reading the manuscript, and it's creepy.
Right. But so something related to that, though, is that I really I felt that there was a rhythm between having the scenes in the lounge and then the cutaway, the close third scenes. And so I sort of felt my way there in terms of which mode to use. Didn't want to linger too much in direct dialogue. And then, but what happened is by having those real-time slow things in the lounge, that allowed me to feel like I could skip from meat to meat, like no fat in terms of the other sections. So in essence, that's, I think, what you're describing. And yeah, spot on. Yes.
I wanted to know if you'd say a little bit more about something you mentioned earlier, and that's actually, I think, related to your last comment, where you said that you seem to be evolving as a writer towards, this is my word, but more ambiguity, where like giving more space for the reader. And then you said at the end that you've maybe always had this quote, poker face. If you just say a little bit more about what would you have done in the past that you wouldn't do in this book, and why that decision to give more space for the reader to maybe withdraw.
Right. So the question is, you seem to be reaching towards more ambiguity or leaving more space for the reader. Are there things that are there kind of tools of the trade that you've abandoned as you've developed as a writer and reaching for that ambiguity?
Probably. Yeah, no, well, I don't know. Maybe that it's hard to know one's own trends, right? But it just seems like something that I'm vibing on right now. And in my early work that was somehow amazingly went to New York and back in a day to the New Yorker, rejected. One of my bad habits as an early writer was to try to control what the reader was thinking a little too much, like try to explain everything a little bit too much. And so I think that was mainly on a sentence level, but I've just become more and more interested in creating characters that I'm not sure what to think. Although I guess that was true in The Interloper as well. There's the murderer, Henry Raven. Do you see humanity in everyone? Is what like sort of central question of that book. And the narrator says it's the noblest mistake to see humanity in everyone, which is paradox. Because you know, growing up in a sort of vaguely American, Canadian, Judeo-Christian thing, yeah, of course you see humanity in everyone. Otherwise, you're a monster. However, you know, if you're have any knowledge of science, obviously there's some people who come out wrong, right? We're all a roll of the genetic dice. So there are people who maybe we shouldn't see humanity in, but who could possibly say such a thing, right? No, I don't believe that, but I do, but I don't, you know, whatever. So the question in that book is, you know, what position to have, you know, towards somebody who seems to be a psychopath or sociopath.
Good answer. Other questions from the internet or no more questions? We have time for one more question. Yes, the person raising their hand.
Shortly after the passage that you just read, he physically goes into the ocean and he rescues this man. He performs CPR.
Yeah.
And your description of the CPR and the actual rescue is so accurate. And I know you were an EMT. Did anything similar to this actually happen to you in your life?
So the question was that the description of CPR was accurate. And I happen to know that that the assessment comes from a medical professional. And who asked if your EMT experience contributed to the
so
realism.
when I was pre-med, I did work as an EMT at UCLA on initially in a transport kind of capacity, and then I graduated up to the rescue thing. But it was while I was working in transport that I had an experience. We would just help out in the hospital when we weren't needed otherwise, and we were in the pediatric ICU, and a patient who had a heart transplant was coding, and she's a kid, and she was so then they just needed a hand because everybody was tired. And the strangest thing, my first thought as it happened was that it felt just like the doll, just like the Resuscitation training doll, like it's like a plate. That's how I described it in the book. So I didn't do the mouth to mouth actually, so that title is a lie. But I did do the chest compressions, and she was revived and then died a half an hour later after just going back and forth. Interestingly, at the time, it was a profound experience, and it was something that I had to process, but I was not nearly as emotional about it as I am right now. And I think it's interesting because when you're younger, had other things happen when I was much younger, you don't process things with the same depth that you do as you add more experience onto your life, including having kids. But that experience has stayed with me. So obviously, that's where that comes from. Yeah, thanks for asking.
I found that description to be a profound relief, because part of the description is that it says that he'd seen CPR in movies, but he didn't know how to do it. And I remember that when I took my CPR class, they said, and by the way, you'll forget how to do this, so you should keep on taking CPR classes for the rest of your life. And I had this feeling of like, I know I should, but that is definitely not what I'm going to do. And so this book made me think, oh, maybe it could actually still work. Okay.
Yeah, you can get away with it.
Yeah.
Just I think one song they recommend is Staying Alive as a pretty good BPM. Staying alive, staying alive.
Okay.
So that, that's
Yeah.
not Annie, Are You Okay? Smooth Criminal.
No.
It's too fast.
Yeah. No, of course. Yeah.
But the Annie, Are You Okay? That's the first thing you do.
That I remember.
But you don't call them Annie.
Yeah. And then you tell someone specifically to call the cops.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. You okay? And then call the cops. And then airway. Make sure that they're not,
right.
The airway's open, and then you do some breathing and some pumping. Although the breathing thing has changed.
They change and update them.
They change and update it. We don't need to breathe as much as we used to.
No,
so
they change
It's
it.
more about pumping.
It's more about pumping, says a medical professional. You learn something new every day at the independent bookstore, I always say. Thank you for coming out. Obviously, Mr. Wilson will be signing all of his books, which are for sale in the back. Yeah. I will only say as a postscript that I have a narrow set of spiritual beliefs, but one of them is that if you enter an independent bookstore and you leave without buying something, you're committing a sin.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in this day and age, when so many events are online, this means if you tuned in to this event and you're not buying a book, you're committing a sin. You certainly don't want to be regarded as a sinner.
And if you've tuned in and you're thinking, maybe I should buy this book, consider taking that extra little step to not buy it from the devil himself, and instead buy it from this independent bookstore. It's not that hard to do.
No.
It still shows up at your house pretty quickly.
Totally.
And it's really important to support these.
It's never accidentally a spatula
centers
when it shows up.
No.
That
never happens.
Yeah.
Never happens. Thank you all for watching online, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I thought that went fine.
Yeah.
I'm just here to tell you that Antoine's going to sign books where those flowers are in the back. Thank you. If that is okay.